So yeah, I'm going to talk just briefly about kind of some of those questions actually that Heather just got to, and raising what it takes to raise sheep and goats in your backyard. And that's actually a picture of me when I was little with my first couple of bottle lambs. And I actually got my start raising sheep in a backyard. Those bottle lambs were kept at my grandparents' house, and they just had a little, I guess, side lot to their house that we kept our lambs in. And so this is actually how I got my start in the sheep industry. But the first thing you have to make sure of is that you are ready to take care of these animals. We talk a lot about the 5 freedoms in animal welfare, and a lot of those are encompassed here. But the most important is access to feed and water, especially fresh water. That's important at all times. It's important that those animals have some shelter and a resting area. Obviously, our sheep and goats aren't meant to be inside like a dog or something, but they should still have some shelter and area to lay down and rest. Making sure that you have a contact with a reputable veterinarian is extremely important. Sometimes it's challenging to find large animal vets that are specifically focused on sheep and goats, but just knowing a large animal vet in your area before you get into raising these animals is extremely important. And then also making sure that you have sufficient space and facilities. I know that was a question that someone asked in the previous session, and we'll go through specifically what some of those recommendations are, and making sure that you have the facilities that can hold sheep and goats. And we'll talk about the uniqueness, I guess, of sheep and goats in their facility requirements. The other thing that's extremely important to consider when you are looking at getting into sheep and goats is the recommendation is to have more than one. They're both very social animals, and in general, they really don't do well on their own. And so if you're going to get into it, you better start with at least 2. And then Heather talked about this a lot as well, but really determining what your goals are and the breeds that will help you accomplish those goals the best. Whether that is wool, meat, or dairy, or even if you just are looking for some kind of companion animal, or someone to just to graze your yard. I know when I was in college, there was a company that actually would lease out their goats to people and let them graze in their yards rather than having to mow them. And so that's definitely an option. Or maybe you have kids that want to get into showing those animals competitively through 4-H and FFA. So you have to determine your goals before you can really dive into what breed matches your production goals the best. Looking at housing requirements, it's important to keep your weather in mind when you're building these. We know that high snowpack can affect some of our buildings and structures and things. So like the sketch there in the middle is actually on runners. And so in a place where you have a lot of snow or something, that shed can be moved. In terms of that open space, typically the recommendation is 20 to 25 square foot per animal for females. You need to add about 5 to 10 square feet if you're going to have rams or bucks. But that's just open space minimum requirements. That's not going to be enough to ensure that if you want those animals to also graze the area that you're keeping them in, 20 to 25 feet is not going to be enough. But that's just your minimum requirement. Whereas if you're going to keep those animals confined and in a barn, or like you can see this Kwanzaa hut there at the bottom, typically your housing requirement only needs to be about 10 to 15 square feet per animal. And that housing requirement or housing structure can be either partially opened or enclosed. And so you can see kind of those top 2 options there. The very top one and the bottom one are from the same operation. They raise some Teeswater wool sheep, long wool sheep in their backyard. And so they have kind of that 3-sided barn that has a door, but they also have the Quonset hut for when they're lambing and shearing. Fencing is also really important to keep in mind when it comes to raising sheep and goats. There's a saying that if water can get through the fence, so can a goat. And so upgrading your fencing to a chain link, woven wire, hog panels is really important in making sure that you don't have upset neighbors when your sheep and goats are out in their backyard. Moving into feeding those animals, what has always really fascinated me about sheep, goats, cattle is the ability for the rumen to actually convert that low quality feed into high quality food and fiber. And so I heard it said best by a professor once, the most abundant plant we can think of is grass, and we can't do anything with grass, but our ruminants can. And so you can also take a low quality hay and they do just fine on it. In general, your sheep and goats are going to consume about 3% of their body weight. So that's, a 100-pound goat is going to need about 3 pounds of feed per day. It's also important that you're feeding those animals for their stage of production, whether they're still growing, whether they're just kind of maintaining, you're going into breeding season, or they're pregnant or lactating. There's different requirements at each of those stages. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on, or if you have questions, we can dive into it a little bit deeper. But feed storage is also important to keep in mind. A hay bale takes up a lot of room, and so being sure that you have a place to store grain and hay that's going to be out of the weather is just important for keeping your feed quality up. Here's just a few options. We talked a little bit about feeding options in the previous section with some questions, but here's a few options. On the top far right of your screen, you'll see kind of just a black plastic feed tray. A lot of those are used for more of your concentrate grain type feeding. And then you can go as complex or, spend as much money on building or buying feeders as you want, or you can go as simple as, that bottom example shows just some plywood and 2x4s to build a feeder. And this option is great when we're talking about kind of that hay contamination in your fleeces. As you can see, they actually put a board up so the animals have a relatively small area that they can actually stick their head in and eat the hay. So it's helped them kind of keep some of the contamination off of the top side of their wool sheep. Feeding options, as I mentioned before, those animals are going to eat about 3% of their body weight daily. And again, that kind of fluctuates depending on time of year and the stage of production that animal's in. But that's kind of just a general rule of thumb, is about 3%. And it's totally up to you how you choose to feed those animals. Typically, especially during the winter months, we're going to feed those animals a grass hay and then supplement with alfalfa, especially during late gestation and early and peak lactation. That alfalfa just adds a little extra protein and gives some extra nutrients for those animals during that time of increased need. You can also give your sheep and goats some kind of a grain ration or diet, depending on, again, what your production goals are. If you're raising that animal for meat, it's not uncommon for those animals to be completely on kind of a grain diet. But of course, we all know that the popularity of grass finished animals and meat is also growing in popularity. So that's certainly an option. But typically we recommend corn to be supplemented during those times of peak production. So again, late gestation and early lactation. And also during breeding. What's unique about sheep and goats is that if you can actually increase their planar nutrition right before breeding, you're more likely to have higher conception rates. If you're going to graze those animals, that's certainly an option as well. And I'll go into that a little bit more in a second and what that would require. But it's also important that those animals have access to some supplementation in terms of minerals and vitamins. A lot of that seems to be dependent on the type of soil in your area, what minerals and vitamins they can get from their own environment. But if we can provide a specific type of mineral for that animal, it's really important. But what's even more important is making sure that that mineral is specific for your animal. Sheep are known for having susceptibility to copper toxicity. They just don't have, their body doesn't need the same amount of copper as a sheep, or excuse me, as a goat or cows. And so making sure that your mineral supplement is specific for sheep or goats. And if you have both, make sure to find kind of an all stock block that's not going to be too high in copper, because that would be detrimental for your sheep. So going into grazing a little bit, what's important to note about sheep and goats is that they are really unique in their grazing behaviors, and even just from each other as well. When we look at the spectrum of grazers, if you will, on the bottom of the screen, you'll see cattle are what we consider browsers, cattle, bison. They tend to be animals with a wider muzzle that just take large swaths of whatever it is that they're eating. And typically your cattle are going to eat more of your grasses, as opposed to your concentrate selectors, which we commonly think of as deer. They have that a little bit slender muzzle, and they're able to be more picky about what they're eating. And so they're going to eat a lot more of twigs and berries and seeds and some of those more nutrient dense feedstuffs. Whereas your sheep and goats are going to kind of fall in the middle, and we call them intermediate grazers. So they'll eat a little bit of grass, a little bit of what we call forbs and browse. And so I like to think of forbs like your flowering plants. Those are going to be your broadleaf, like clover, is going to be a forb. Whereas your browse typically tends to be more of your woody plants. And so as you can see there, your sheep are going to eat kind of a more generalized mixture of all three, whereas goats are going to eat a lot more browse and forbs. And so especially if you are a big gardener and have decorative shrubs and flowers and things like that, making sure that your sheep and goats don't have access to those, because they will eat them. What's also important to keep in mind when you're grazing is this take half, leave half concept. And so what that means is, let's say the pasture that you're going to graze your animals in, the grass is about 4 inches tall. So once that grass gets to 2 inches tall, so half of it, you'll take those animals off the pasture. And really what that breaks down to more specifically, I guess, those animals are going to only consume about 25%. The other 25 is going to be where they've either laid in it, stepped in it, just kind of the wasted forage, if you will. But that take half, leave half concept helps make sure that your pastures aren't going to get overgrazed. And in terms of the specific amount of acreage required for a goat or a sheep, it kind of varies among regions. So like here in Western South Dakota, we're looking at about 35 acres to run a ewe and a lamb for an entire year. And so working with your local range specialist or sheep specialist can help you identify kind of the exact requirements needed if you are going to do a continuous grazing for your sheep and goats. The other option is to kind of, I guess, feed your sheep and goats like you would your dogs. You know, we feed our dogs a little in the morning and a little at night, and you can do the same thing with sheep and goats. They're typically only going to graze in the cool morning and the cool evening anyways. And so if you have the time and labor to do so, you can just feed those animals or let them graze in the morning and then bring them back into confinement during the hot afternoon and then turn them back out in the evenings. That can help mitigate some of that continuous all-day pressure on your pastures or in your backyard as well. So if you do choose to do the full production process and also kid and lamb out those does and ewes, this is probably my favorite time of year. It's certainly maybe the most stressful time of year, but it's definitely maybe the most rewarding. And so typically we recommend that inside you set up what we call birthing jugs. You might hear them as lambing jugs, kidding jugs. And those are typically about a 4 foot by 4 foot pen. They're not very big. They're kind of designed so that the mother can bond with her babies. And so you can see a picture of that in the bottom left-hand corner. That's just one idea of how you could set up those lambing jugs. It's important that you're feeding that ewe up off the ground. One, it helps reduce the amount of waste. She's not stepping on it and, going to the bathroom and that kind of things on her feed. It's also going to decrease the amount of contaminants that are in your feed. And so if you can have your feeder lifted, and then it's also important that you're keeping that jug at least above freezing. These babies are tougher than we give them credit for, but the number one cause of lamb mortality tends to be hypothermia. And so if you can find a way to keep those lambs and kids warm, either through a heat lamp, or they make really cool electric heating pads that can go in the barn. It's always said that the more benefit, I guess, you can give, or the more you can help those little ones along in the first week of life, the better off they are for the rest of their life. And so typically they should be kept in the jug for a minimum of 48 hours just to make sure that, your mom is lactating properly, they're suckling and bonded with their mom as well. But you can certainly keep them in there longer if you need to, especially when you think of like your first time mamas. They tend to need a little bit more time to bond and really learn what they're doing, I guess. It's also key that when they're in those birthing jugs that they're getting colostrum, and they need to get adequate amounts within the first 12 hours. And so that's the very first milk that mom produces. It's full of antibodies and a lot of other really rich nutrients that those babies need just to get off the ground. And so in terms of supplies, as I mentioned, heat lamps are super beneficial, or some kind of heating pad. Iodine's important. When those babies are born, they're going to have a very wet navel, and that umbilical is extremely susceptible to what we call navel ill. And so that iodine, or I've heard of an iodine alcohol mixture, can help dry up and keep all that bacteria out of their umbilical. Electrolyte supplements are also really nice to have in hand. For whatever reason, sometimes those babies just don't want to get going. And so that electrolyte supplement can help give them a boost. Keeping a disinfectant on hand is important also. There are some zoonotic diseases that can be transferred through the placenta of a ewe, like Q fever. And so just making sure that you're maintaining good hygiene, both for yourself and for your animals, is important. Thermometers are important. If something starts to look like, they've got droopy ears, they're not feeling good, the first thing we want to do is check their temperature. If you are going to go ahead and use vaccinations, typically the most commonly used one at this point in time is for Clostridium perfringens type C and D. So that's also intertoxemia, or overeating disease. And it should be given to the ewe at least 4 weeks before lambing, and then also given to the lambs or kids at least 7 days of age. If you're going to use ear tags, that's also important, and then any of your docking and castration equipment. So then after those lambs and kids are born, they can be outside, but it's also important that we're preparing those animals for weaning. And so one way we can do that is by providing a creep feed. And so what this is it's just a grain that is available only to the babies and not to the moms. And so you can see this creep pen design down in the bottom. Those vertical bars are only going to be wide enough apart for the lambs and kids to get through, and not the ewes. But what's important is that you are still going to need to supplement your ewes either with some alfalfa or corn, because up to that 6 to 8 weeks in gestation, lactation, they're still going to have a really high nutrient requirement just trying to feed those newborn babies. But if you can give that creep feed to those lambs and kids, it actually helps the microbes in the rumen start to develop. Because when those babies suckle, the milk is actually bypassing the rumen. And later in life, the rumen is our major fermentation vat for that animal. So starting to develop that rumen at a young age is extremely important. And then typically weaning occurs at 90 to 120 days. I know Heather talked a little bit about shearing, so I'll keep this pretty brief. But it is extremely important if you're going to have sheep, because it keeps them cool and healthy, and it can be done before lambing or before they're turned out on summer pasture. And then you also just have to keep in mind whether or not you need to heavily skirt or take out those undesirable parts of the fleece to increase your value.
Jaelyn, you have about 3 minutes.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Okay. No, you're fine.
Heather talked a little bit about this too, so we'll just skip that. Just to briefly cover costs, I'll just leave this slide up here and I'll just open it to questions. So typically, these are just roundabout numbers. As I mentioned, you can go as expensive or as cheap as you want to on some of this stuff. Typically, I would recommend not to cut as many corners as you can. But your feed cost for those animals, I estimate it to be about $200 an animal if you're feeding like a small square bale. In terms of your capital and startup, again, as much work as you want to put into this, you can, put just a couple thousand into housing. It could, some of those Quonset huts are an upwards of $7,000 to $10,000. But on the flip side of that, you also have to keep in mind your income. All of these prices you see here are just kind of your commercial industry, what you would get if you were to just sell through a sale barn or through like a commercial wool buyer. But you certainly have some value added if you take those products to the next level and are selling to a hand spinner or some kind of a niche market as well.